Within 6 months of this time, Michael Armstrong, promoted to a place of trust, might have been seen sitting upon the hillside in one of the most romantic spots in Westmoreland, a shepherd's maud wrapped round his person, a sheep-dog at his feet, and his master's flocks nibbling the short grass around him on all sides. Many were the solitary hours he thus passed, and very rich was the harvest they brought him. Had the boy remained a year or two longer that in the state that blocks out the forms of nature, preconsumes the reason, famishes the heart, shuts up the infant being in itself, and makes its very spring a season of decay. Had Michael remained a year or two longer at the Deep Valley factory in the state thus admirably and accurately described, it would have been too late for any contemplation of God's works to have roused his withered spirit to worship and to hope. But as it was, his mind seemed to awaken day by day from the long and heavy sleep in which it had been plunged. With an intellect naturally vigorous and covetous of acquirement, and having had his first infant stretch of thought happily and indelibly directed, though with primeval simplicity, to one God and Father of all, his transition from a condition in which scarcely could you fancy that a gleam could break from out those languid eyes, to one sublime from present purity and joy, was rapid and delightful. His heavy losses were not forgotten, but while he meditated beneath the bright arch of heaven on the mother and brother he had so fondly loved, there were so many sublime and hope-inspiring thoughts mixed with his sorrow that it could hardly have been called painful. The worthy statesman to whose service he had vowed himself, though he did not, perhaps, follow Michael through all the improving processes which his mountain occupation led to, nor very clearly comprehended the elevating effect of the skyey influences under which he lived, was no way slow in perceiving that the Samaritan feeling he had so opportunely displayed in the township of Ashley had bound to his service one of the most trustworthy, active, and intelligent lads he had ever met with. There is always, moreover, in the human heart a propensity to cherish whatever we have preserved, and this feeling, joined to his more worldly-minded approbations of Michael's good gifts, rendered Muster Thornton exceedingly fond of the boy, and well inclined at all times to grant him every reasonable indulgence. But Michael rarely taxed his kindness as far as it was ready to go. Once he had asked and obtained leave to mount to the top of Helvellyn, and once to make a sabbatical's journey over the mountain tops to Ulswater. These were the only occasions on which he had expressed any wish to wander beyond the immediate neighborhood of the farmer's sheep walks, and, in truth, this immediate neighborhood included so many mountain torrents, glassy lakes, stupendous crags, and sylvan solitudes that there was little need to go beyond it in order to gratify a passion for the picturesque. But when Michael had attained the age of 18 years, a longing and somewhat restless desire seized him to revisit the place of his birth, to seek for the graves of his mother and Edward, to learn tidings of the kind-hearted Martha, to discover, if possible, whether his own escape from the deep valley had been communicated to Sir Matthew, and to ascertain whether he still stood in any danger of being reclaimed as an apprentice, in case of its being discovered that he was at liberty. As to any danger of being personally recognized at Ashley, he feared it not, conscious that from his remarkably tall stature and florid health he was too unlike the factory child of former days to run any risk of being known. It was, however, some months after this wish first suggested itself before he took courage to name it to his indulgent master. When at length, however, he did so, the good man not only gave his free consent, but declared himself well pleased that such a project had entered his favourite's head. "It will do thee a power of good, Mike," said he. "The only fault I have to find with thee is, that thee be'st too steady for a lad of thy years, and that looks as if, with all our care and coaxing, we had not yet been able to make thee forget thy sorrowful childhood. Set off, in God's name, my boy. Stay as long as thou wilt, but only promise to come back at last, for I think it would be a heartache working to part with thee." Michael gratefully promised a speedy return, and dressed in his best attire, he set forth upon his much-wished-for pilgrimage to his early home. It was the pride, the springtide of the year. Every leaf was opened, yet every leaf retained the new-born freshness of its lovely green. The birds saluted him from every bush, the herds lowed from amidst their dewy banquet, in a note that spoke their measureless content, and every object on which his bright young eye fixed itself seemed to echo the abounding gladness of his own heart. How elastic was the step with which he passed along! How proudly and thankfully did he feel conscious of his own high place amidst this wondrous creation! And how perfect was he convinced, despite all he had read during his lone hours on the mountainside, of the splendor of the cities of the earth, that nothing on its whole surface could exceed in grace and glory the majesty of the gorgeous sun as he rose triumphantly out of his bed of gold. Had every thought of the boy's heart been chronicled, a very poetical sort of hymn would have been the result. But as it was, all the glowing thankfulness, the heavenward rapture, and the joy supreme was but for himself alone. Yet it was not thrown away, for Michael enjoyed his own existence during these early hours with an intensity that made him feel all his former suffering most benignantly overpaid by his present happiness. Yet in the midst of this, tears more than once started to his eyes, as he thought of his mother and the brother he had so entirely loved. His very soul longed to have Edward by his side, as various fancies chased each through his fertile brain, and the image of little Fanny too, with her soft reasoning eyes, as she used to look at him when preaching patience at the Deep Valley Mill, as he fondly labored to recall it, made him sigh in the midst of his pleasure and his freedom, to think how sad it was that all he had ever loved should have passed away from his eyes forever. But amidst the million proofs of tender commiseration for the suffering incidents of necessity to our place in creation, which those who run may read, if they are not very great dunces indeed, there is, perhaps, none more remarkable than the gradual softening of the agony which all who survive what they love are doomed to feel. The state which follows, though as sad as the darkness of the lonely night, made visible by the pale backward glance of the parting moon, has the same soothing stillness too. Passion is over, anxiety at rest, and we feel more than consoled, we feel joyful as we remember that we too shall pass away and follow them. The journey to Ashley cost Michael 3 days' smart walking, but his pockets were no longer in the condition they had been at the time of his never-to-be-forgotten escape from the Deep Valley. He proved himself a good and faithful servant, and the worthy yeoman paid him accordingly, so that he had wherewithal to recruit his spirits and his strength as he jogged along, and reached the hospitable Nag's Head in his native town on the third evening, rather the better than the worse for his pleasant toil. His first walk on the following morning was to Ashley churchyard, but here he was obliged to content himself by knowing that the dear relics of those he wished to honor were near him, for, of course, the only indication by which he could guess whereabouts these precious relics lay was to be found in the want of all memorial. On the sunny side of Ashley churchyard, a number of handsome tombstones may be seen. Many massive a monument is there, protected by its strong and stately rail, and thereupon may be read, by those who list, the important facts that some who bore a Christian appellation lies below. To the north, where the grass grows strongest, though the sun never comes to cheer it, are a multitude of little nameless, unclaimed hillocks, closely wedged together, and rarely showing even a withy band across the swelling sod, to testify that someone has cared for what lay hidden under it. To this green republic Michael turned himself, and knew full surely that it was there his mother lay. Another, though even as humble as himself, might, under similar feelings, have addressed inquiries to the parish sexton, and endeavored to set his memory to work as to the exact spot where he had buried her. But this Michael dared not do, for it would be at once losing the advantage of his incognito, and laying himself very needlessly open to the danger of being reclaimed by his old enemy, Sir Matthew, as a bound apprentice who had run away. So he contented himself with walking carefully and with reverential tread through and amongst the many grassy mounds, permitting his tears to flow freely as he thought of Teddy and the dear gentle mother who had so equally loved them both, and then turned slowly away, following a path that brought him the distance of a mile or so to the Brookford factory. The sensation which he felt when the great many-eyed monster first met his sight was one of unmixed pleasure. He literally hugged himself and blessed the freedom of his limbs, the firm and healthy action of his pulse, and the delicious consciousness that he was no man's slave. For many minutes he stood still to enjoy this, and as his eyes perused line after line of the dusky smoke-stained windows and recalled the early sufferings he had endured within them, his very heart swelled with gratitude for the change, and he blessed God aloud. But as her approached nearer and perceived the dim shadowy figures slowly moving here and there, and thought upon the condition of each of them, he almost repented his selfish joy, and blamed the ecstasy that for a while had made him so utterly forget that thousands were imprisoned still, though he was free. On and on he walked with his eyes immovably fixed upon the hideous fabric till, sooner than he expected, he stood before the gates. He had conceived no previous plan by which to enter it, and knew that without some specific business, real or feigned, it would be impossible. But while he stood waiting the danger of possible discovery against his very strong inclination to see what alteration time had made in the troop within, whether he should recognize any among them, and whether his old tyrant, Parsons, was still their chief, the gates opened, and one of the engine men, a grisly fellow, whom he well remembered when his sable hair was somewhat less silvered, came forth. He gave Mchl a look that very plainly said, "What do you want?" And in truth, his neat appearance, unstained skin, and free, unshrinking eye very naturally suggested the idea that he could have no business there. "Is Mr. Parsons within?" said Mchl boldly, and daring the inquiry as much because he knew not what to say, as from any deliberate resolution to do so. "Yes," replied the man, "he is about the place somewhere. I seed him not more than 10 minutes ago." Mchl nodded his head, and walked through the gates into the court, across which he had passed in a trembling 1,000 times. Nor was he now quite free from the slight feeling of alarm at the idea of meeting the sharp eyes of his former terrible taskmaster, and felt much inclined to blame himself for the curious temerity which had brought him so nearly within his grip. But it was too late to retreat, for at the distance of a dozen yards he saw Parsons before him, coming forth from the building into the court. On seeing the stranger, he immediately approached him. Mchl touched his hat. What may be your business here be, young man?" said Parsons, eyeing him from top to toe. "I called in, sir, to inquire whether you happen to want a spinner, and what the wages may be," said Mchl. "Is it for yourself?" demanded Parsons, knitting his brows, looking at him with a sort of incredulous sneer. "Why, no, sir. It is for a kinsman who happens to be out of employ," replied Mchl, coloring from the usual consciousness of deceit, and from the same cause casting his eyes upon the ground, thereby displaying the remarkable length of his black eyelashes, and giving to his whole countenance a look much more resembling that of former days than he had worn when he first entered. Parsons looked at him with a sort of vague idea that he had seen him before. "Where do you come from?" said he. "From Westmoreland, sir. I have been living in service there for these 4 years past." "And pray what may your name be?" Robert Thornton, sir," replied Mchl, blushing again as he thus unceremoniously borrowed the appellation of his worthy master. "Have you ever worked in a factory yourself?" "Yes, sir, I have, when I was a boy," said Mchl, from a mere want of skill and hardihood in the art of lying. "And you think you have bettered yourself, I suppose, with your fine buff waistcoat and the rest of it? No, we don't want no spinners here." Mchl by no means unwillingly obeyed this dismissal, and walked away more than half ashamed of his achievement. "If I didn't know that Mchl Armstrong was dead, I should swear that there chap was him," said a girl somewhat older than our imprudent masquerader, who had been watching him very earnestly during the foregoing conversation. The observation was not addressed to the overlooker, but to another girl who had brought the speaker her dinner to prevent her from leaving some particular work on which she was employed. "What's that you say, Sykes?" said Parsons, turning quickly towards her. "I was saying, sir, as that boy was uncountably like Michael Armstrong, as used to live in his mother's back kitchen. He wasn't above a year or two younger than me, and I knowed him as well as I did my own brothers." "Stuff and nonsense, girl. All the world knows that young rascal died years ago, and fuss enough there was made about it at that about that mad miss at Milford, who, I suppose, found out that she was their cousin or something of the sort, for she took it so to heart that she sold her house, excuse me, that she sold her house and lands and ran away with another of 'em to some foreign country for fear he should die too. Sure, you must mind all that queer story." "Yes, sir," replied the girl. "I remember it right well, and that's the reason why I says I know it can't be him." "Yet upon my soul, now you mention it, he was the very image of him. I fancied I'd looked at him that surely as I'd seen him somewhere before. But it can't be. A dead dog is dead, all the world over." Yes, sure, sir," responded Kitty Sykes, who, being what is called a very slight girl, was not unfrequently indulged with a little condescending notice from Mr. Parsons. "But 'twas his queer curly black hair and his particular-looking eyes as put it into my head." "And if you go on talking of it, Sykes, in that way you will be putting it into my head too. And after all, there is nothing so very impossible in it. Nobody in these parts could really know much about it, you see, and there's no reason, as I can tell, why the scamp might not have run away from the Deep, that is, stocking weaver's manufacturer that he was sent apprentice to, and they as ought to have stopped him might have given out that he was dead," replied the overlooker. "Then if it was possible," resumed Kitty Sykes, "I wouldn't mind taking my bodily oath that there young fellow was Michael Armstrong, and nobody else." "Egad, I wish I hadn't let him go," cried Parsons, running to the gates. "He was 'prentice till 21, and if he was run away, he's liable to be taken up and put in prison by the first as catches him." Kitty Sykes took the liberty of running to the gate also, but to say the truth, she had no wish at all that Mr. Parsons should catch up with him and put him into prison. The girl, though she had prudence enough not to communicate the opinion to her friend Mr. Parsons, thought the stranger by far the handsomest young fellow she had ever seen, and secretly determined, if she could catch sight of him again, that she would give him a hint to keep clear of his old acquaintance. "There he goes!" cried Parsons, watching Michael with an upright gait and rapid strides. He was pursuing his way by the well-remembered path which led from the factory to Dowling Lodge. "There he goes! He don't look like one of those mill people anyway, and yet the fellow said that he'd worked in a factory. Did you hear him, Kitty?" "Yes, sir," replied the girl, "and it was just then as I felt so unaccountably sure that, unless it was out and out impossible, it must be Michael Armstrong as was speaking. I never did see such eyes as Michael's, nor such hair neither." "And there he goes, I bet a sovereign," rejoined the overlooker, "to take a look at his old quarters at the lodge. Kitty, I'll give you a glass of gin and a shilling if you'll run after him. You can run like a hare, I know. Run and bring him back, Kitty, there's a darling, and says I have got some good news to tell him." Off started the girl with right good will, having her own reasons for wishing to do the errand, as well as a very sufficient inclination to gain the promised reward. Mr. Parsons by no means overrated her running powers, and had she been less fleet, she would have failed in her object, for Michael walked briskly, and without any inclination to remain longer in the vicinity of the mill, though by no means conscious that he had been recognized. He had just turned the corner of a hedge when the girl overtook him, so that their colloquy did not take place within the sight of the overlooker.